So, Eric, I wanted to talk about GLP-1s and peptides. And basically, my question to you is, where do you think the use of them by the everyday person is taking the fitness industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just for a little bit of background, I think we just need to acknowledge how much has changed in the last decade. If you actually look at when were the first GLP-1s approved for use and actually rolled out for specifically for in diabetes, they were relatively niche, and they've been around for more than a decade plus, if I recall correctly. So while they're not explicitly new, they feel very new, and they're definitely new in terms of the widespread application for treatment of obesity, and then more so, people getting access to them through private means or gray area means, off-label use, that type of thing, depending upon the country you're in, for like personal aesthetic-based things. People who don't have obesity are using them a lot, and there's even ethics involved there. Like there has been, and this is changing as more competing pharmaceutical companies come to the market. There have been issues there with people using them kind of for personal lifestyle, fitness-related, help me stay beach lean kind of use, to where people with legitimate medical needs have had a shortage and unable to get them. And all that's a very changing flux state right now. So, and like I said, some of that's U.S. based, some of it's different in other countries. So I think, what does that mean? Where are we at? I think one thing you'll notice is that you get varying degrees of people in the fitness space embracing the utility of these. And I think that is very cultural. As someone who's a competitive bodybuilder, but also has been a personal trainer educator, researcher in the space, you will have noticed that forever, some of the more quote unquote hardcore kind of fitness voices, they've often focused on, I would say, the personal responsibility side of this, the extreme ownership side of this, the David Goggins kind of approach of, hey, you really need to, like harden up, quit being a bitch, look in the mirror, all that language.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's no place for that. Certainly not. I think we all sometimes have looked in the mirror and gone like, you just have to push through this. But I think anyone who has been successful personally long term, if they're honest with themselves in anything, or if they have adapted a lifestyle of fitness, especially trainers, know that you can't white knuckle and force yourself into a new lifestyle and have every day be, let's wake up, self-flagellate, whip myself, and then go to the gym and eat healthy. That's not what it looks like. Maybe required at times to get through rough patches, or it may be required at times the right personality of a person when they have a slip up. And it may be necessary in certain sporting contexts, like you're fatigued last quarter, or getting through special forces things. But those are not the same thing as I'm trying to change my lifestyle from now at the age of 50 until I'm no longer on the planet, right? So if we really look at what needs to be done, that kind of messaging is not helpful long term. And whether the person honestly realizes that, the content creator promoting this message, or whether it's just kind of the way they think, like people, like if they're actually feeling morally self-righteous and looking down on people with obesity or who don't eat healthy or don't exercise and seeing themselves as morally superior, I think GLP-1 effectiveness and access and uptake has exposed them. Some of them are actively angry about GLP-1s being around, despite the fact that they look incredibly safe. They have really good clinical use. It is pretty damn clear that the reason we've had a persistent obesity epidemic, despite more access to information, more access to gyms, and more access to healthy foods, with some caveats there, food deserts and whatnot, over the last 20 or 30 years, has been all these interventions to try to give people more options to leverage that personal responsibility kind of hammer, if you will. But it has not curbed the obesity epidemic. It's been great for the people who can make that transition, but the reality is their environment has changed so much, even in the last 50 years, that the default setting for most people in Western societies is moving less, eating more, and that not actually matching their hunger and satiety signals. And then boom, you introduce a GLP-1 agonist, and we see this massive, persistent weight loss, improvements in metabolic health, very low risk profile and side effects, and it's becoming increasingly, available and affordable. And most importantly, is it starts to give people wins, and preliminary data and anecdotal reports even suggest that people who get some wins on the board with GLP-1s and initial weight loss are more likely to actually build some self-efficacy, feel like they can do this, and adopt exercise. Because nothing's more demotivating than starting to exercise, starting to eat healthy, and not seeing the scale weight budge, because you have such a dysregulated appetite and metabolic profile that even when you start to do things right, it's just not enough in the face of these environmental changes. So all that is to say, I generally think GLP-1s, when used appropriately and people are educated and they accompany lifestyle changes, are incredibly positive. And when fitness industry people frame them as cheating or a weakness, it's clear that they're much more interested in like self-righteous virtue signaling rather than actually helping people. So that's my first thought on just the GLP-1s, which are a peptide drug. But the whole peptide conversation is related to that, but a whole other kettle of fish, which we can talk about next if you'd like.
So I want to stay on the GLP-1s for a minute because I've coached and am coaching people that use it. They're not competitive bodybuilders. They're just your everyday person trying to get leaner, and they feel so much empowerment from using it. But I did also want to kind of talk about what happens to people when they get access to it, when it does work, and then they lose access to it for many different things. Like, I coach people in the States as well, and there's a lot of kind of like insurance and cost things that sometimes don't go their way. I guess this is more of, potentially a behavioral question, but what advice do you have for people that get results and then have to kind of go without it because they can't get it again?
Great question.
Maybe not indefinitely, but for the next 2 or 3 months while their insurance reviews this or that, because I've seen this situation a few times.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And the preliminary data we have is that when people use GLP-1s and lose weight, then go off, on average, they follow the same trajectory that we see in general weight loss, where people start to regain weight. And that's an average response, but it is not the individual response. And the really interesting thing here is that there's some people who overshoot where they came from. There's some people who actually maintain weight loss or even keep losing for a little bit. And then some people regain some weight, some people regain less. So if you look at some of the data on this, like Kevin Hall did some pretty cool research showing that essentially the more weight you lose, the stronger the appetite signaling is to rebound. So this is nothing new. This isn't unique to GLP-1s. This is just the reality of successful quote-unquote weight loss being different from successful weight loss maintenance. And when we look at what predicts successful weight loss maintenance completely outside of GLP-1 use, it comes down to maintaining a lot of certain activities that help us behaviorally regulate the unnatural food environment and built environment that we live in. So if you look at the National Weight Loss Control Registry, which is self-selecting for people who've successfully lost weight, so it's not useful to say, here's what you should do, but it is useful for us to understand what do people who successfully maintain weight loss do. There's a couple of specific things. One, they maintain a high degree of activity and exercise. And this doesn't just help the energy outside of the equation, it also helps to regulate our appetite signaling. So when people focus on activity or nutrition or processed food, they kind of forget that they all work together in this kind of unfortunate cycle. So when you're inactive, and we've known this forever, not forever, we've known this for decades, going back to kind of pre-obesity epidemic research in factories where you have people with different activity levels, you see that when you are sedentary, which you could say is probably getting less than the equivalent of 5,000 steps per day if you're an office worker, if you're the manager in a factory, your body weight is higher than the people working the factory floor, just persistently, even though you're in the same region. And that's really interesting. And then if you look at the people on the factory floor, all of them being in what we consider by modern standards highly active and definitely non-sedentary, they all weigh the same, yet their calorie intake scales with activity. So this is what's called a J-shaped curve of activity regulation, and it's the coupling between appetite signaling and signals of being full and body weight regulation. So you settle at a higher point even when you have a non, like even if you're living in an environment that is not quite the modern world where kind of everybody's victim to this. But if you go back to, the Bengali mill study where this was done, you see that the factory workers, all the same body weight, but they are able to couple their energy intake with their expenditure, but not the sedentary managers. So you get metabolic dysregulation, and you can see this in acute studies, and you can also see this in the long-term risk profiles with all-cause mortality that scale with activity. And once you are sufficiently active, which is roughly around what I would say getting between 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day is kind of your baseline minimum on average, that's when you start to get this better coupling. So maintaining activity, that makes a lot of sense. These folks are not just exercising to lose weight, they are exercising and maintaining it as part of a healthy lifestyle, and they've probably found some enjoyment with it. Again, they're not self-flagellating, so they do it for the rest of their lives, and that really helps. Another thing they do is that they have some type of biofeedback autoregulatory mechanism that is objective. Some of them track calories, some of them track body weight, some of them do both, but they maintain some type of awareness, of monitoring, so that they know when they might be sliding back towards weight gain, and that probably allows them to intervene. It doesn't mean they're necessarily hitting target macros or hitting target calories or trying to weigh a certain amount, but they're maintaining awareness instead of kind of putting their head in the sand. And that's important because some data indicates that the typical obesity trajectory in Western countries is very subtle and pernicious. You basically are consuming less than 100 calories over your maintenance intake over the course of multiple weeks sometimes. And if you're in the States where we cluster all of our holidays together and we eat a lot, sometimes almost all the weight gain is explained. Exactly. It's almost all explained basically from Thanksgiving to New Year's, right? Or not all of it, but most of it. So what this means is that you really only need to offset, 30, 40, 50 calories a day to kind of prevent these slow slides up. And you and I, we've both been personal trainers. You talk to somebody and maybe they come to you in their middle age, their kids have moved out, and they kind of look up and they go, what happened? And it sneaks up on them, right? And it's this accumulative slow slight energy balance resulting in weight gain that you don't notice even over the course of months sometimes. So I think kind of those two factors are pretty big. Another thing that is quite persistently shown among people who maintain weight loss is what's called meal rhythm. So even though it is true that there's an incredible amount of flexibility you can have in terms of intermittent fasting or eating 6 meals a day or 3, and kind of the evidence-based position has been hey, as long as you control for total calories and protein, 3, 4, 5, 6 meals a day, it's not going to have a massive impact on your goals and fitness. What probably will have a negative impact is bouncing all over those and not having a consistent meal rhythm. So you want structured flexibility, if you can't have a meal, don't freak out and bump your protein and your calories into the next one or vice versa. But generally you should just kind of not have the decision fatigue of what am I eating today or what time am I having breakfast. You kind of know what you're doing. So that way you don't have to be as subject to the quote-unquote food noise or the options or the things that give you the opportunity to make an error. And then finally, I would say this isn't shown in the National Weight Control Registry, but broadly when you look at some of the behavioral things that really seem to help, a lot of it comes down to personal environmental manipulation. Doing things like not having foods that lead to overconsumption or high calorie intake in the house, or keeping them in the back of the cupboard, while you have fruits, vegetables, and lean proteins filling your refrigerator on the counter, easy to eat, and that you kind of set yourself up so that your automatic behaviors don't require active restraint or decisions to prevent you from sliding into that small calorie surplus that eventually gets you off track. So how does that apply to GLP-1 use? I think it's tempting to go, right, I just want to take a pill and get this weight loss done, and you know what, I don't really need to change my lifestyle if I can just keep taking these. And that's not untrue, But like you said, what if you can't keep taking them? What if you start to get, GI distress because of some other comorbidity that you have to take a drug for, and now all of a sudden you got to go off them, right? And this does happen. We're still investigating, are they safe to use during pregnancy? And they probably are, but right now, just due to liability issues, your doc may say, let's bring you off these. And then you don't want to have excessive weight gain during pregnancy because that can negatively impact, the child, right? So there's times where inevitably someone who is on these drugs, even if they plan to take them for a lifetime, may not be able to. So I think it is the clinician's duty to really ensure that these are done as an adjunct to overall lifestyle and behavior change. And I think if we did more research to figure out, okay, well, what's going on in the people who regain weight and even rebound the most versus those who are actually, maintaining that weight loss or even continuing to lose, I think that would probably be the differentiator. Whether or not you're just kind of taking a pill and being like, whatever, I'm just going to eat less ice cream because I'm less hungry. That works, and it is like, forced inadvertent portion control. But if it's inadvertent unconscious portion control, when it goes away, then the portions are going to go up. So I think that is really kind of what we need to focus on is those bridging that gap once you start to change that initial behavior. And I think there is some good reason to expect that once you kind of remove that food noise and you can set up this kind of lifestyle and environment that really supports long-term weight loss maintenance, that it should be successful, because that's exactly what we see in typical weight loss, So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that whole just eat less ice cream because I'm less hungry, it works until it doesn't work. And that's where a lot of people get stuck when they don't have the help of a coach or they don't have the knowledge to kind of reach deeper into skill sets that can help. And I think a broader thing of what you're talking about is identity, and that comes, massively into obesity. And I guess what I've read, obviously you're more well versed in the research, but that is a big factor in terms of the weight that you can manage and maintain. And it was all those things that you say, what do you naturally do? Do you have the cheesecake and the donuts at the front of the cupboard? Or do you have an identity that is more around, I just eat fruit when I'm hungry, or I know that I'm not actually hungry, I'll probably just eat later. And I think that's one thing, as I've talked to more and more people that struggle with their weight and are, not necessarily obese, but maybe they are obese or they are just overweight, is that whole identity thing. Like, I got asked the other day, don't you just have days where you just feel like doing nothing and just like sitting on the couch? And I was obviously not trying to come from a place of I'm so much better than you because it's just physical activity, but I've always had this natural inkling to want to move. It's just something that I've always had. And I've heard that it's like a potential, it's like a non-obesogenic genotype or something like that. I might have made that up, but I've kind of heard that some people genetically have a more predisposition to move, and I've always had that. Like, I wear a Whoop now. My average steps are 17,000 a day, and I'm not actively trying to. Oh man, like I'm not going to bed until I hit 17,000. I do have 2 young kids, so I'm running around after them a lot, and like during the weekend they go up to like 20,000 because we'll go to the beach and we'll do kind of stuff like that. But that's where it comes down to it, I think, because like we do go to the beach. We don't just, sit at home and put the TV on and then they just run around and I just sit on my butt type of thing. Or days where I may want to just sit on the couch and watch Netflix, I don't, because I don't actually have that drive, that desire. But this person that I was talking to did. And I guess there's kind of like another question, but like, is there something to that people just naturally have more of a tendency to move genetically?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 parts to this question. There's one is identity, and second is kind of nature versus nurture, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I was asking multiple things there.
They're both really good questions, and they're related. And then what goes into being a quote unquote like obesogenic phenotype, right? So I think the first one is really important for any personal trainer to hear, because the way we get taught to set goals is generally probably a little too short-term and mid-term aligned at best. Like, how often do we get taught we should do SMART goals, right?
Yeah.
Specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. And if you've ever wondered why there's a bit of overlap between like some of the letters, sometimes you'll have like two versions of realistic in there. It's because this actually got adapted from an 80s business journal SMART acronym that was given to managers, and A used to stand for assignable. So this was actually specifically for a framework of goal setting on like sales teams. Of, hey, we're going to have realistic, time-bound, I'm going to assign you this task, and we're going to sell a lot of, encyclopedias or whatever in 1985. And then for whatever reason, it got picked up by the personal training industry, slightly modified and not very well done. But when we look at actual goal-setting frameworks and the research on behavior change, the key core element is exactly what you're talking about. It's called a superordinate goal. And what it is not I want to lose 20 pounds, and that's my superordinate goal. It's actually attached to the way human motivation works. And also, we think of motivation incorrectly in the fitness industry. We think motivation, we think like what a group X instructor does, right? And when I say motivation, I want to use the prefix that, your motive, the why. And central to anyone's why is their values, and central to anyone's values is their identity. So superordinate goals are actually identity-based when you look at them, and that's why they're so powerful. An example would be that you're just not a person who is sedentary. It's not how you see yourself. It's not who you want to be. It doesn't align with your values, and it's not what you enjoy. So it doesn't require effort for you to be active because it's what you do. So, I had a conversation with just right across the street is the YMCA in the city, which is great for me because I'm a competitive bodybuilder and I'm trying to level up before I get too old to keep leveling up, and I'm near my genetic ceiling. So I'm trying to get in all of this ridiculous bodybuilding training volume that makes no sense outside of the kind of goals I'm doing. I treat this like a legitimate athlete because I actually do have professional status in the WNBF, and it's something I really care about. So I sometimes will train twice a day. I'll find an hour in my day, go over there, do it again when I can. If not, then I have these pretty brutal marathon long sessions. So I like to split it up to get my volume in. And the person at the desk, bless her heart, was like, how do you have the discipline to do this? And I'm like, I don't know that discipline's the right word. I'm not whipping myself across the street. I'm excited. Like this is who I am. I am someone who has been lifting weights for half my life. I've been competing in bodybuilding for 18 years. Like, I love this. Some aspect of my core identity is tied to competitive bodybuilding and definitely lifting weights. So that's kind of what we want to get into our clients, our family, anyone we're trying to help, is to shift them towards seeing themselves as someone who does these things so they don't have to kind of keep exerting willpower and making choices that are hard. And that's going to be much more natural for some people than others, which dovetails nicely to your question of what is the quote-unquote obesogenic phenotype. The funny thing is I dug deep into my 23andMe genetic data, and I actually found out, which no one would expect because of how much behavioral modification I've done over the years, that I actually have some phenotypes towards being hungrier than most people, burning fewer calories, and also regulating salt and fat poorer than most people. So, and I also have certain neurobiology. I actually have been diagnosed with adult ADHD. And if you look at the prevalence of obesity in people with adult ADHD, food noise is a big deal for them because it's kind of like, squirrel, but it's like, cheeseburger, right? If we're thinking kind of, like you can be distracted and you need stimulation, and if you're sitting at home and there's idle time, you have a refrigerator. So on paper, I should be not a healthy body weight. But that's not those aren't the only things that predict or influence what someone's kind of resting leanness level is. There's also specific modifiers at the fat cell level. Like what is your kind of quote-unquote lower intervention point, which is what we might call a quote-unquote set point in the fitness industry. Where does your body fat naturally settle biologically, which is heavily influenced and very clearly controverted and subsumed by our environment in the Western world. Like, some people can be naturally lean and survive, the built environment we're in, but not most people, hence the obesity epidemic. But I have a relatively low set point. Like I walk around okay at maybe less than 15 pounds over stage weight, and I compete at 180 pounds, or like 81.5 kilos. So that's, as a percentage, I'm walking around pretty lean, and I look relatively lean to most people, right? But that's not always the case. Early 20 years ago, when I started getting into the scene, it was all like enhanced IFBB pros, multiplied power lifters who are super heavyweight. You got to chuck the olive oil on the pizza, eat big to get big. And I was kind of a tall, skinny kid. So I actually like ballooned up and got fat for the first time. And then I had to like slowly get back down to reasonable off-season weights. So my stage weight's gone up, but my off-season weight has gone down over the years, just to show you how unnecessarily, I'm a drug-free bodybuilder, so I probably don't need to be, 40 pounds over stage weight in the off-season, right? So anyway, all this is to say is that your environment and your influences, your certain aspects of your physiology, certain aspects of your psychology that are either genetically determined or epigenetic, all kind of create this combination of, are you more likely to have have obesity later in life? A great example is that it sounds like you have some genetic predispositions towards higher activity, and that leads to your young kids being highly active. They're hitting 20,000 steps. That's the culture of your family, right? You go to the beach, you do active things. You don't sit around all on your phones, right? Now imagine, I don't know this to be the case, that the mother of your children actually has the exact opposite genetic profile, and your kids maybe lean more towards that for whatever reason. But the way they're being raised right now is going to have a huge influence. And we see this, that independent of some of the genetic influences, that people who are raised in a household by parents with obesity are at far greater risk of developing obesity. And, we don't have a whole society where 60% of people have a genetic predisposition towards obesity. We have a society that makes most people have obesity, and then some have it even worse if they have that genetic predisposition. But I think, you and I are both examples of people who on the outside look like they lead pretty similar lives, and walk around relatively lean, love exercising, are very active. We have similar identity. But the underlying genetics and epigenetics and predispositions we both have aren't exactly the same. I've got some pros and cons. It sounds like you've got some pros. I'm sure you might have some cons. Maybe not, you lucky bastard. But ultimately, the people who do make these big lifestyle changes, I think they should have some hope in the fact that the obesity epidemic exists. And the reason why I say that is that the obesity epidemic proves that our natural genetics for weight regulation can be easily overcome by the environment. And that means it's true the other way too. I mean, we are better at defending against, weight loss than weight gain, but it also shows that if we had an entire society where only like 10% of people had obesity, even just in the 70s and 80s, and now it's much higher, we have a little more agency if we manipulate our own personal environment. Do things like you just take the first parking space you see. You don't go up to the second floor, park, and try to get the Rockstar parking lot. You take the stairs when you can. You try to find and live in an area in a city or wherever you're at where you can walk most places, and all the other things I mentioned about where you store and what food you store in your home and how visible it is. And then developing a superordinate goal, which can take time. It can take a lifetime sometimes, around being someone who's active, healthy, which means thinking about your values and sitting down. And this is why motivational interviewing is so powerful. Someone will come to you as a trainer and they'll say, hey, I want to lose weight. And the reason they might present to you is, well, my profile from my doctor came back negative, or, I'm a little embarrassed. But if you really dig in, you find out that they want to be around to play with their grandkids. They want to feel young again, and they don't see themselves as who they are anymore. And that's a hard thing to face, but it's also a very powerful thing if they do face it, embrace it, and then start to see change. And then they can create this identity and based upon those values, and you can tap into that as a trainer, and you want them to tap into it on a daily basis for themselves when they set goals of like, this is not who I am, and I want to live my values. And then that identity gets bolstered, to build that self-efficacy, and you can leverage aspects of what we know about human motivation, like relatedness, like autonomy and competence. So you're helping them build upon those 3 pillars of self-determination theory, which helps us understand human motivation. I'm feeling like I'm getting better at this thing. I have control and direction in my life, and I have the support and the understanding of people around me. So when you do all that, that's extremely powerful. It overcomes, and it's likely to overcome a lot of those environmental, built modern processed food, all the stuff that we target and identify correctly. We can overcome all of that. And I think, going back to your original question, the GLP-1s should be seen just as a way to support that, to reduce the friction, to reduce the food noise a little bit, to kind of get us back to like 1970, so that we can be as effective. Because athletics, training, fitness, these were all very popular before the obesity epidemic. And I think some trainers worry that they're going to become obsolete just because we have associated personal training with weight loss for so long. You both my and your entire lifetime and career as trainers, it's been weight loss, weight loss, weight loss, weight loss, weight loss. But there have been strength and conditioning coaches, fitness trainers, and people interested in pushing their bodies and living in alignment with their values and health since long before the obesity epidemic.
Yeah, I think it's so encouraging as well, like you were saying, that so much is built into environment and lifestyle and, once again, identity, which I think is encouraging because they are, I'm not going to say easy to manipulate, but they are malleable. Like, you can change them. Where if it was, oh, you've just got the obese genotype, you're screwed, just, just go and be obese. Like, that is not the case. And I'm not saying that, once again, it's just the David Goggins mentality, but you do have that encouragement to actually make that change. Because on my side of the family, there's a lot of obesity, but there's also a lot of other things like alcoholism.
Yes.
There is, where my family is from. Like, I'm a Maori. Like my dad is Maori, and all my cousins are, on my dad's side. Like, some of them are really jacked and some of them are built, and they just train ad hoc. And they just have that, that genetics where they just have like a big chest and big arms. You're like, far out, you like hardly train, and I spend my whole life and I'm still, just the size of your quadricep. But so there's that sort of genetic expression because they have this environment where it's like fun to lift weights. But then I also have other family members, and not that we all have the same genetics, but they're very sedentary. They drink a lot. They don't get up too much in terms of physical activity. And they've had diabetes, and I've also had uncles and aunties that have passed away just because of their lifestyle. So I feel like what I'm trying to do within my family is kind of take all the best of the genetics that we have and kind of drop all the lifestyle stuff so that I can ultimately get the best deal out of the genetics that I have. Because I think the Maori people have a great, ability to build muscle and frames and like dense bones. Like, I have friends where we just literally compare like wrist size sometimes, and I have dense bones. That's like something that I like with my genetics. But then there are other things that I think if I didn't have the identity or lifestyle or habits that I have, that they would be expressed differently. Because even my dad, he's in his late 60s and he's only started lifting weights for the last 3 or 4 years. And his identity has started to shift. He used to be someone that after work, he would go and get a beer and, sit there and, chat with his mates. And now that has kind of become less of something that he does, now he will go to the gym and he'll go for a swim, and things like that. And, it's questionable what he does in the gym sometimes, because I try to give him advice and, get him to use my coaching app, but he doesn't know how to use his phone. So it's frustrating. So he'll just ask people at the pub sometimes what to do at the gym. So he's sitting there on the elliptical saying, "Oh, son, I was doing this for like 90 minutes. Is that good?" I was like, "Oh, it's better than nothing, but maybe try and do this and do that." But his identity has changed and his weight has come down. And from someone who has struggled with his weight, kind of like beer gut. He's a truck driver, that type of like have a steak and cheese pie and a fizzy and just kind of keep going. He's actually made much healthier changes. His doctors are happier, and he's also happier. So I wanted to share that because, obviously me and my dad share pretty similar genetics, and he's had a part where his lifestyle has influenced him negatively, and now it's slowly turning around, and he's starting to see the benefits from that. But to jump onto peptides, do you think that they are also, I guess, the kind of like muscle building GLP-1s that people are looking for? Is that how they're seeing it? Because that's kind of what I see. Like, there's a few people asking, "Oh, what are they? Should I be trying them? Are they like steroids? Are they not? Are they safe?" Because I got a DM the other day asking to like what my rates were to do a sponsored post for them. You know what I mean? And I've seen personal trainers put biohacker and longevity in their bio and then push a peptide. So obviously there's money to be made. There's this quick fix kind of scammy element. So I have a bad feeling in my gut, but I'm sure in some ways there is some efficacy toward them. So like, is that how they're kind of being seen at the moment? Like the GLP-1s for muscle building, or are they different?
Yeah, this is one where you can get people talking across each other. Like, we recently made a post advertising our issue of Mass. So Mass Research Review is where we do a monthly review of hot topics in the fitness industry from an evidence-based perspective. And we kind of had an assumption people knew what we were talking about when we were talking about some of these unregulated, novel, no human research or extremely limited human research peptide drugs. And we said, hey, man, this is a huge scientific overreach. There's no human research. And we posted about it, and we had people going like, GLP-1s have been great for me, and insulin's great. Like, I think a lot of people are talking about different things when they talk about peptide drugs. So peptide drugs is really just kind of a broad classification of drugs that spans things that have been in existence for decades. It spans things that are really well researched and have gone all the way through stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, and things that were wholly abandoned because of dangerous research, but were never scheduled or fully picked up and can be accessed as quote-unquote research-only chemicals for personal use, that are now being marketed by quote-unquote wellness clinics as kind of acting as a gray zone middleman, especially in certain regions, depending upon the regulatory nature. So, we made that mistake, and we created this shitstorm online of misunderstanding. And I got thrown under the bus, and I did a lot of apologizing and clarifying. And then we made the article free, and everyone's like, oh, But the funny thing is, even when we put much more specifics out there, people were very strongly in certain camps against the idea that there could be any harm here, and it wasn't just a positive, and that we can't trust the medical establishment. This is just like how steroids used to be, saying they didn't work for athletes. So there's this weird cross-pollination between, in my experience as someone who's in the bodybuilding scene, what has historically been kind of the niche underground, like steroid and ancillary performance enhancing and image enhancing drug world, with what has now become commonplace. And the reason is that these drugs, the GLP-1 drugs, work. And they've kind of normalized getting, a weekly shot in the arm, because we're just now developing effective oral ones, right? That may change, but right now it is pretty normal to go, hey, I want to lose weight or change my body, and I can just get a script, and then I get a shot in my arm. And when there was, and this is more of a U.S. thing, when there was a massive shortage, there was something called compounding pharmacies, which are these pharmacies that can get access to the drugs in different means and potentially sell you GLP-1s when there's a shortage and do things semi-off-label. So it's kind of normalized this idea of taking hold of your own use of injectable drugs that modify your body composition and make that kind of all good. And the reality is that while absolutely peptide drugs are fantastic if we're talking about I'm a type 1 diabetic and I need to use insulin, or certain peptides that have been fully researched gone through clinical trials, are approved, and you get them through your insurance and use them for specific causes. But some of the most popular ones in kind of the wellness space, like I think BP157, that everyone swears by being this amazing healing drug that will accelerate tissue repair and recovery, there is only animal data on that that's actual like outcome data, like RCTs. And the human trials were, hey, we asked, some people a year later when they took this peptide, do you think it helped your recovery? And then we have this case study of like 2 people, and they were like, yeah, it was great, So no actual, yeah, like a phone call, right? Yeah. So it's published anecdote, which is fine, and anecdotal information is useful. But here's the thing: it's like when we do placebo-controlled trials, there's a reason for that. Expectation is really big. And not just like the magic of placebo. Like the reason why if I do a blood pressure trial and I'm a pharmaceutical company and I want to have a placebo-controlled trial is imagine you go and you find out you have high blood pressure and then you find out there's a clinical trial you can participate in. You're concerned about it. So you choose, like, I would love to be in this trial. I would love to get my blood pressure lowered. And you don't know if you're going to get assigned to the placebo or the actual drug. You're not just going to maintain your lifestyle and then start taking a pill. You're going to probably start to be more active, try to eat less saturated fat, and do things to actively lower your blood pressure, cholesterol, and modify in a positive way your overall heart risk. So independent of whether or not you're in the clinical trial and taking the pill, placebo, or blood pressure, we need to know, controlling for those lifestyle behaviors that you're modifying and the expectancy effect as well, is this drug having an additional impact? And when you get injured, you don't stay injured forever. The natural state of the human body is it's trying to recover back to baseline. And when we look at a lot of studies, this is why we've seen this big shift in like the physiotherapy world and pain management, where we're trying to acknowledge the biopsychosocial environment, and we're trying to get a little less focused on purely the biomedical, because there is some data showing that for certain surgeries, not all, or for certain treatments, not all, that like for certain types of lower back pain or hip surgeries, etc., if you don't do surgery, people will kind of get back to baseline, and that surgeries don't provide a higher rate of recovery in some cases, and that there are disconnects between pain and imaging. And if I take 100 people off the street, let's say 20 of them complain of lower back pain, and the other 80 have no sign of back pain. In those 80, there's going to be a lot of people with slipped discs in their lower back who are asymptomatic. And if we just go with the imaging, we might decide to intervene and actually make the thing worse. And in the people who have back pain, it's not actually reliable that they might also have a slipped disc. So there's this disconnect. And I'm not saying they're completely unrelated, but pain management, and intervention is pretty complex. And we want to make sure that we are considering all these factors, because if we just look at a bunch of people who go to a Reddit forum, hear that BP157 is amazing, they have a halo effect because they're related to other peptide drugs which are approved and are very effective, like GLP-1s, and they get someone telling them, hey, I am a legitimate wellness clinic. I am a doctor, which is true. You can come on in here and I can get you these. And it's not technically illegal, but I'm just basically purchasing these 4 research-only drugs, and then you're buying it as a private person, not using your insurance, so it's kind of legal-ish because the FDA hasn't cracked down on it. It feels legit, right? And it is quote-unquote normalized or legit enough that even people like you or I or any kind of quote-unquote fitness influencer or trainer is finding ways to make this something that they can use as a top-up service, almost like, suggesting supplements. So this very blurry area makes it very difficult to talk in broad strokes about this without getting something wrong like we did in that post. So I think there's a huge difference between experimental drugs that were abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry because they either didn't work, had negative effects, or had safety issues, and actual peptide drugs that have been well researched. And it may be that some of these drugs that have don't have a lot of research behind them will become quite good. But the issue is that there's a handful of them that almost certainly will not, because they actually got abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry because they were not doing what they're proposed to do. So, like, for example, and I can't remember them off the top of my head because they have these weird letter number combinations. There was a specific peptide drug that was used to try to control like fat gain, and it resulted in fat gain. And I think it was used in a like a cancer model or something like that. I can't quite remember. And now it's being promoted as just based on the mechanism of this should result in fat loss. And that was a human trial showing this is bad. And then why didn't they keep researching it? It's not because the medical industry wants to control it. They're like, this isn't going to make money. It doesn't work, right? There was another one that did start on phase 1 clinical trials. Somebody had a heart attack and they shut it down, and the pharmaceutical company said, I don't want none of that. Let's explore other options, right? So, and now that is back on the market, right? So, or things that have only been shown to be working in genetically modified mice, right? So it's possible that those specific trials, just got dropped. A company went bankrupt during COVID, never got it picked back up, and there's better options. I'm not saying none of them could get picked back up and researched and result in becoming quite good, but I don't think a lot of them are, and some of them that are very popular do have safety issues. Some of them, you're talking about accelerating growth in certain tissues. How do we know that wouldn't accelerate a benign tumor growth? I'm not saying it will, but we definitely should know that before we start taking unregulated drugs, right? And more so, this is like when we're talking about these pharmaceutical grade drugs that are being put together in shady conditions and sometimes potentially not mixed well or to the same standard that you would want for something putting in your body, but marketed as very similar to GLP-1, there's a quality control issue. So there was data that was done in the UK where they had a bunch of people, and this is where it's legal to use anabolic steroids, it's just illegal to sell it, right? So you come on in, bring your gear, no risk, no legal implications, and we'll test it and tell you what you got. Something like 80% of the anabolic steroids that were brought and lab tested were either not the same drug or they were under or overdosed. So there's a huge issue of people taking illicit drugs that is independent of the actual effect of the drug themselves. This is why I'm relatively hard line on the supplement industry, especially if you're getting it from like the States or other places where it's post hoc regulated. It's like, yeah, even if this is an evidence-based supplement, are you actually getting that? And this is why I'm a huge advocate for third-party testing. So there's a complex thing going on here, and I think a lot of people are not well educated enough to discern between these subtle differences. And then the people involved who want to sell you this stuff are not going to be unbiased because there's a huge financial incentive. So that's a long answer to what seemed like a relatively straightforward question, but this space is evolving quickly. We're going to see government agencies start to crack down. And in certain places like the US, it's weird. RFK announced on the Rogan podcast that they were removing some of the regulatory restrictions on some of these very popular GLP-1, some of these peptide drugs. And that's not the same as saying now they're FDA approved, because then actually you have to go through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. But what it means is that they could get researched. So it's like bad and good. On the good side, if pharmaceutical companies legitimately think that some of these drugs are worth researching, they now can, because the safety concerns have been lifted off them. But I think the frank reality is that they abandoned them for a reason in the beginning. And the downside of that is now that these peptide drugs that were semi-regulated or even less regulated, now these wellness quote-unquote clinics can more easily access them, market them, and get them to people with less fear of any type of enforcement by the FDA or the DEA or anything like that. And you can get it online too. So it's an international issue, right? And the final thing I'll say, Brock, is one of the common things that came up in people who really don't care about the safety of the regulatory stuff, and they're more interested in, listen, I want to take charge of my own destiny. I'm fine with taking drugs, and why are we not trusting the anecdotal experiences of thousands of people? This is just like back in the day when all the athletes were taking steroids, but the medical community and the research community was decades behind and said these don't work, they're not healthy. That is a real thing. And there was a huge amount of distrust that was built through the 90s. You can even find qualitative interviews with bodybuilders who they'd go to their doctor. And this was before the harm reduction model, where your doctor would say, listen, it's your body, your choice. If you want to use illicit drugs, that's fine. I'm not just going to sit here and finger wag at you, but I will make sure you're informed, and we're going to monitor your blood work, and we'll do what we can to mitigate the negative effects of what you're experiencing. This was before docs did that. So people stopped going to their doctor. There's bodybuilders now in their 50s who've never, gone to the doctor because they're enhanced and they just don't want to deal with it. But a modern doctor should actually be like, that's okay. I don't think it's what you should do, and here's my advice, but let's run blood work and let's get you to see an endocrinologist, and maybe we don't take this, and can you maybe try to get a different supplier because that is a horse steroid, not the one you thought you were taking, whatever, right? So that kind of cultural hangover and belief that the medical and research communities are way behind the bell curve is not coming from nowhere. And it was because it got so much negative hype, and we had the congressional hearings in the 90s of baseball players being brought before Congress, grilling them from a moral, self-righteous perspective about them using performance-enhancing drugs, that essentially they got scheduled as a class 3 substance, so the same as like methamphetamine or cocaine or whatever, or heroin in the States, and then research stopped. So athletes became kind of their self-incubating research, and all of the knowledge we have about how to use anabolic androgenic steroids come from these underground steroid handbooks that were written by people, quite literally in the case of Dan Duchaine, like while they're in prison, for steroid distribution. And the, enhanced bodybuilders and strength athletes of the world, they figured out, at least by experience, what is the best way to use performance-enhancing drugs. So there's this, athletic kind of online fitness community that's just like whatever, researchers are idiots. And they're applying that same logic to these peptide drugs. Everybody on the forums, everybody on Reddit says BP157 is great. And what they're missing, and why the parallel is not a useful analogy, and it's not the same, is that anabolic steroids always worked. They worked fantastic. And they were heavily invested in, exploited, and researched since starting in the late 30s all the way through the 70s and 80s, and then bam, harsh stop. Drug testing became really important. You start threatening baseball, that's like threatening American Pie or hot dogs. Congress is going to get involved. Kibosh is put. And, then researchers are like, well, it's not evidence-based because there's no research. And, absence of evidence of absence. And here we are. But these specific peptide drugs that are popular were researched. And people started to go down that pathway, and they either went, it doesn't work, I don't think it's safe, or it does a negative effect. So there's a reason why because there's nothing to stop pharmaceutical companies from researching these drugs further, but they have actively stopped. And you have to ask the question, why? Because I think what everyone can agree on all sides of the fence is pharmaceutical companies know how to make money, right? Mm-hmm. So why aren't they investing in this? It's not because they legally can't, like the steroid era. So I think it's really important, and I've tried to point this out to some of these people. I'm like, this is not the same. This isn't people acting like, oral turinabol is not useful, and then you're like, oh, well, why is all of East Germany using it for their, their Olympic team, right? This is not the same, even though it's being pushed that way. So anyway, long answer, like I said, but it's a complex environment, man.
Yeah, but I think the people that are trying to look for the solution of using these peptides aren't having such a deep thought like you, or like they should be, because even in my circle, right, not even with lifting weights, I train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. There are people, because injuries are so prominent, just from training, like not even from a competitive perspective. I'm sure it's like as soon as you compete, injuries are higher because there's a lot more on the line. But there's people in my gym that are using BPC 157, and they're most probably on a Reddit forum. They're not thinking about it. In the WhatsApp chat, it's like, yo, do you have some? My ankle sore. How can I get it? Type of thing. Who do you use? All this. It's just very bro.
Yeah.
It's very kind of like meathead energy, as you were saying. Like maybe back in the day, like, hey, I want to, be an enhanced lifter now. Who's your guy? Send me the number, and I'll just sort it out. There's no, hey, do you have a study on it, or do you have a control trial on it? It's just very, I just want that quick fix, and that's like, I'm thankful that you took the time to answer that, because it is not straightforward. And I thought about it once because I competed and I got injured with my foot, and I was like, if it's harmless, I will do it. But I got cold feet, and I was like, I'm not like, I don't know much about it. I don't know enough about it, and I didn't feel confident enough about it with when I tried to look into it. But not saying that I go further than everyone else, but I really care what I put in my body, and also I do read research, so I was like, it should be a bit more obvious. There should be a bit more green lights flashing at me with what I read, in terms of like, this could happen, this might be a good idea, this might not, but there wasn't much of that, if anything at all. It was a couple of years ago. I did want to touch on, with everything that you have contributed to the fitness industry, with the research that you've put forward, because you're so deep into it, what have you changed your mind on with training? It could be recent. It could be a few years ago, but I'm interested from a coaching perspective and from someone that lifts, what you've changed your mind on.
Yeah, I think there's two big ones that come to mind. One is a more nuanced understanding of why full range of motion training is generally better for building muscle. This was an association we saw in the research, but if you ask someone to explain why, they would kind of throw like, a bunch of shit at the wall and see what sticks, right? More metabolic, stress, and you're getting more volume technically, because it's a longer range of motion, and it's actually displacement times, reps times load, if you want to get an actual. And they didn't really have a great rationale. If you look at some like three or 4 years ago, kind of like the full range of motion kind of push that like RP strength or Mike Israetel was saying, it wasn't related to anything related to muscle length or tension. So in the last 5 or 6 years, and there was actually research by McMahon all the way back in like 2014, if I recall correctly, so more than a decade ago, they were actually comparing what we now call lengthened partials versus shortened partials, or training that emphasizes training in the initial range of motion. So this would be like a partial squat that nobody does. Like when you think partial squats, you think of YouTuber, lists it and then like getting obliterated in the comments because you're only squatting halfway down. Like, it doesn't count, bro. But what we're talking about, a lengthened partial squat, is like going all the way down, only coming halfway up. And you're like, just like, I'm going to staple myself eventually, right? Nobody does that, until now. So once we started looking at comparisons between different types of partial range of motion training, and actually a meta-analysis recently came out that really highlights this, we see that if you're comparing a end range of motion partial, like just say remember when 21s were big? Like, you do the top, you do the bottom, you do the full range, you do 777, right? So 21 reps. Yeah. Those top range of motion curls are way less effective than those bottom range of motion curls. And those bottom range of motion curls are probably just as good as the full range. So what's going on here? Well, we come to find out kind of as we investigate this through multiple different means. If we control range of motion but manipulate joint position, like if we compare a lying leg curl versus a seated leg curl, it's still the same amount of change of degrees in range of motion if you had a goniometer, looking at the knee joint angle around the knee. So it's still the same range of motion, but what's going on when you're in a seated leg curl? Oh, it's like that sit and reach test. You're pre-stretching the hamstrings at the hip. So now when you do that same leg curl, there's more tension on the hamstring. It's being stretched, and that seems to be providing more mechanical tension, increasing the stimulus for actual hypertrophy. And there's times when this is a minor difference or a major difference, and it has to do with the anatomy of the muscle. Is it biarticular like the hamstring? It crosses two joints so you can more easily stretch it. What's the resistance profile of the exercise? And are you comparing vast differences in range of motion, like you're just doing the first part of a curl or the end range of motion of a curl? Or is it a minor difference, like you're doing a slight change in the resistance profile, like a dumbbell lateral raise versus a cable lateral raise? And And we see that basically when there is more of a difference in the resistance profile or an extreme difference in the range of motion where you're totally cutting off the lengthened position versus only doing it, that's when these differences really emerge. So conceptually, we know that if you place tension at a longer muscle length on a muscle when doing resistance training, that should result in a greater signal and stimulus for hypertrophy. It's not just because you're using a full range of motion. But obviously, when you have minor differences and you're trying to super optimize things, then you're going to have a minor effect. So I think that's kind of where we need to temper our expectations here when you compare certain things that are really more similar than they are different. And that's when we kind of get more null results than positive results confirming that high tensions at long muscle lengths are better. So that's one thing. The other one kind of goes back to why I'm popping across the street to the YMCA twice a day. And this is understanding the role of volume for hypertrophy. And importantly, this is the volume not just of, sets that may be ending at a 5 RPE or you could have done 5 or 6 more reps, but, hard training, hard sets, working sets, right? Unfortunately, there does seem to be there's a dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, meaning the more you do, the better you get, which is pretty intuitive. This is kind of like any other adaptation. But just like basic fundamentals of sports science will tell you, you have to do an appropriate dose that you are currently adapted to that doesn't exceed your capacities to adapt or potentially risk injury. So that means it's not just about how much you're doing, but the pace at which you build up to it and your recovery environment. But when we look at short-term studies where those factors really are not going to come into play, like I can crush anybody for 8 weeks and they might just adapt better, but I don't know what happened to them 8 weeks after that while they kept trying to do it, right? Or it's a study on only bicep curls and we go, oh, wow, more volume is better for bicep growth. Well, what if I do that for every single exercise, every single muscle group, right? Maybe that's not quite as sustainable. So anyway, what we see is this, dose-response relationship with volume, but I think we have a tough time thinking in terms of nonlinear relationships as humans, right? So what I mean by that is that there's actually this diminishing dose response. And we like to think in black and white terms. More is better, cool, I'll do more. But what if I told you that you had to double your volume to get a 10% increase on the return on investment? Many people would be like, nah, and there's a huge difference in application of this information. If you're a competitive bodybuilder trying to compete at Worlds next year and you are near your genetic limit and you have built a high workload capacity over 21 years and you're like, anything I can do to offset the slowing rate of muscle growth that I have just from being closer and closer to my genetic quote-unquote ceiling, I'll take it. Then you might go across the street to the Y twice a day to do 30 sets per muscle group. And you might be named Eric Helms. But if, let's say, you're one of Brock's clients you're consulting with who has 4 hours a week to train and wants to get the most return on investment, you're not going to try to jam-pack 30 sets into that. You'll say, hey, guess what? The first 10 sets you do are going to be way more valuable with a much higher return on investment, much more stimulus than the last 10 sets you would do. So, if you were to move from 20 to 30 sets versus 10 to 20, you're going to get less on a per set basis by doing that. And you're going to get 60, 70% of your gains from getting up to those 10 sets, especially if we maintain high quality. And if you enjoy it and it doesn't feel like you're trying to slog through this marathon each week to get through all your training. So I think this is where the high intensity training crowd and the kind of volume-based training crowd have always had this crosstalk that doesn't quite make sense. If you go all the way back, and I'll talk history just for a second, to when high-intensity training, HIIT, which is low-volume, high-intensity, was popularized. It actually got popularized by Arthur Jones, who's the guy who released Nautilus equipment. In an era where machines were not common, we're talking the 60s, and the cell was basically the cell of curves, right? It's do this circuit, one set to failure on these machines. You don't have to become a weightlifting expert, and you can do it in 30 minutes, and you can do it once per week, and you'll get fantastic gains. And believe it or not, that's actually true. You can get probably 50, 40% of all the possible gains you could get just from your first handful of sets, especially if you push it close to failure. And machines are maybe not for all of the same adaptations that you're interested in, like balance, axial loading, if, spinal density is important to you or whatever. But for like hypertrophy and general aesthetics, machines and free weights are not interchangeable, but they're both quite good. And you could use a machine-only based training. So the sell of high-intensity training has always been the biggest bang for your buck with the minimal investment. And the people who are promoting volume-based training are almost always exclusively bodybuilders, and they're talking about getting literally everything out of you can and being willing to do something an investor would tell you not to do. It's like put in 10 times more effort for 1% more gains. And I'm like, that's terrible. But you're like, listen, I don't care about maximizing my investment. I want to dot every single I, cross every single T, and shit, I'll dot some J's. Like, I want it all, Opposite mentalities. And that's why you get this kind of crosstalk. So what I've come to realize that was not clear with the data previously is that there's not this kind of U-shaped relationship with volume and gains that has been postulated, at least not in terms of muscle physiology itself, where you do more and more volume and eventually you don't get any return on investment. Then eventually you do too much, you overtrain, and you actually gain muscle slower or lose muscle because you're pushing too hard. We know now from kind of like a very, very sanitized reductionist view that if we put you in a lab, we control everything else, and the only thing we change is the variable volume, it's going to get more and more and more growth, but eventually it'll diminish to the point where you're not. But we don't see this sharp downturn. There's no pernicious secret negative effect where actually you're doing 30 sets and you would grow more if you did 20, if all else was equal. Now in the real world though, absolutely there's a U-shaped curve because you get burnout, injury, the thing about quote unquote overtraining, and you and I probably both experienced this, long before you actually start to see all your numbers in the gym start going down just because you're doing too much, you get tendinitis, you get an abrupt injury that you didn't expect, but sometimes I'm hitting PRs and then later in the workout, I get hurt, So that's not the same as like endurance training. Well, obviously you can get overuse injuries, but if you talk to endurance athletes at the highest level, there's a real risk to where they're doing the volume necessary to progress and the recovery environment gets worse, they don't eat enough, and all of a sudden they get put in the hole and they don't recover for months. And it's a minority of the time, but in symptoms of quote-unquote overtraining, which really is just defined in sports science as you're starting to see multiple weeks and months of downturn performance that even when you do a deload or pull back, doesn't return, that's the definition of overtraining. And it's not explained by other things like illness or insufficient food intake. That's only occurring in like 10 to 20% of athletes, true overtraining syndrome. But it almost never happens in resistance training. There's arguably only one study ever that's observed it, despite doing ridiculous things that I don't know how got passed by an ethics board to the participants. So evolutionarily, it makes sense. Like your ability to notice a tiger and run away or climb a tree or run into a cave and use this quick, explosive, high force output activity has kept us alive. So it's like the kind of the last thing that gets negatively impacted by cumulative fatigue, if you will. Other things are going to start falling off real quick. You're going to get immune suppression, sleep disruption, psychological loss of motivation, illness, and muscle tears before your muscle won't produce force, right? So if we take a really, really, really reductionist view in the lab, not ecologically valid perspective, there's no downside to doing more volume. But in the real world, there absolutely is, and you have to respect your recovery environment and what you're currently adapted to and auto-regulate based upon all the signals you get. So that means for someone like me, I'm not afraid of accidentally doing too much volume, but I just need to focus on the recovery. And is this actually sustainable? So right now, for example, I'm deloading my quads. I think my quads are growing great, but I'm getting a lot of quad tendinitis. And I'm not talking patellar tendinitis, which happens from running and acute things and stuff like that. But quad tendinitis is almost exclusively like just an overuse injury. You're putting too much, like you're just squatting too much, bro. Not that I squat, I hack squat. But so like for me, I'm like, okay, my muscles are fine, but there's other things my muscles are attached to, like the human being that I am, in addition to the tendon. So I have to regulate this because eventually that will create a feedback loop where the pain is insufficient to where I can't load it properly, and this persistent quad tendinitis becomes something more, and then I'm in the hole. So I think that's that's a shift in perspective, because I used to truly believe, there's a point where I should just be doing lower volume, or some people respond better to lower volume than higher volume. But I think it is much more related to the environmental factors and what you're adapted to than it is any kind of intrinsically negative effect. Like if you, and we actually have this data now, like if you look at a muscle cell and you expose it to more and more and more volume. So you take two groups, high volume, low volume, and we do a biopsy and we look at anabolic signaling. There's not less anabolic signaling in a group that's doing a ridiculously high amount of volume that was dropped on them all of a sudden, what we would describe as like an overtraining stimulus or overreaching. That's not why they're having negative downsides. It's everything else.
Right. This is quite punishing to hear because my volume has dropped significantly since having like 2 young children, and I've been trying to convince myself that low volume is okay.
It is okay, and I'm gonna pull you back from the brink of despair, my friend. So, Brock, the cool thing to know is that while more volume produces more hypertrophy, low volumes produce hypertrophy, and I think to some degree, you're a pretty built dude, right? So, there is a question of what is the least amount you can do to maintain your current level of muscularity, which is probably more than it would take for someone who's a newbie, right? Or to prevent someone from having sarcopenia in old age. But it's probably not an extreme amount, I would say that, working with high-level bodybuilders, let's say they were used to doing 20 to 30 sets, they can probably maintain that level of muscularity by doing only 10 sets. And in some cases, with people who do respond really well, excellent exercise selection, and they're putting a lot of quality into that, maybe even make some incrementally small gains. And this has been observed in studies on powerlifters using a kind of a minimum effective dose approach, or even just doing like 3 to 9 sets per week on squats, bench, and deadlift. They're still progressing so long as they're including that high-intensity training. And there's parallels on this as well in other adaptations, like if you look at, there's a cool meta-analysis where they looked at like what's the optimal dose of aerobic training to get the largest VO2 response increase in sedentary elderly adults. And it is less than the amount that is required to maintain the VO2 max in elite cyclists, right? You put grandma on it, she gets in way better shape and is doing great. Doctors loving it. And, if she did more, she wouldn't adapt any faster. You put, your Tour de France cyclist on it, and he no longer qualifies for Tour de France, and it makes sense, So
yeah. I guess it's just been a time thing, to be honest, with having a young family. So I've been trying to pull on other levers, like training at a higher intensity, going closer to failure, less reps in reserve. I've been trying to do more bang for buck exercises. I've always really had the squats and the RDLs and everything in there, but they're kind of staying in there, weighted chin-ups and all that kind of stuff. But actually, one thing that I have found with lower volume training is that my strength has been able to continue to progress, if not faster, because previously, as I was, training more, I think there were times where I would train where I wasn't as recovered, and that's more of a sleep thing. But now that I've been it was a big thing for me internally. It was like, first world problems, but I was like when I had children, I had to accept the fact that I'm training 4 days a week now, and like the bro dies inside, because I used to train like when I was at, like I was saying, at City Fitness, when I was a face-to-face personal trainer, I would train 2 times a day. I had, Monday to Friday was like 2 times a week. Saturday, Sunday was just like a longer session. So I had like these, 12 sessions a week that I would try to squeeze in. But on that other side of thing, where you were saying with the volume thing, my lower back was constantly sore. Yep. Despite good form, despite this and that, and maybe I could have made better exercise selection, less squats, more hack squats like you do, or, less lower back intensive work, maybe less bent over rows and pendlay rows, more single arm dumbbell rows or cable rows to alleviate any lower back usage. But I just, once again, just enjoy training. That's the problem. When you enjoy training, you just love the shit, so you just keep doing it. But so injuries actually kind of pulled me back. But sorry, to come back to my point, what I've actually found is my strength has been able to increase at probably a faster rate because I'm actually more recovered. Like I'm training legs and I'm like, oh, there's like no inkling of soreness. Where sometimes there was like a little bit just because it was so crammed in, and I was pushing the volume a bit more. Where I would be like, I can train through this a little bit. It wasn't too bad, but now I'm like completely fresh. I probably could have trained a couple of days earlier, and my strength is still increasing. Is there like to give hope for the low volume folks or busy parents like myself? Is there anything that like with strength, because it's around muscle building, the volume conversation with strength? Is it like, is there a similar curve? Is it more volume is better, or is there a sweet spot?
Good
or does
question.
it depend on your recoverability as well?
Yeah, there's two parts to it. The data on strength shows that there is also a diminishing returns relationship with volume, but it's way steeper. So the big context here is that these studies are lasting 6 to 12 weeks in 95% of cases. So over that kind of time period, strength is heavily dependent upon motor learning adaptations, to some degree hypertrophy if it's a less trained population in the study, but basically getting good at lifting, right? And learning how to actually recruit muscle, not have coactivation, increase rate coding, all the stuff that we call quote unquote neuromuscular adaptations. That's what's going to dictate strength. So doing more and more work, you can only get so much, deliberate practice on these lifts in a short time period. So volume is not as strong of a signal, and load becomes a much stronger signal. Very, very clearly, we see the heavier you lift, the better you get lifting heavy. Specificity, right? Now the downside or that's not true. The reality is that long term, we don't have 5-year studies on strength, right? Muscle size is a strong contributor and predicts differences in elite level athletes in terms of their strength. If you take a bunch of power lifters in the same weight class and we compare cross-sectional area, lean body mass, or muscle thickness, it will pretty reliably distinguish between who is a slightly better elite level power lifter versus someone who's not as big or not as good. It's how big are the muscles that are contributing to force production, right? So what that means is that absolutely in the short term, a low volume specific approach is going to result in just as much strength gain as higher volume. And probably in the practical world, your experiences, why they're seen and replicated by so many, is that when you're doing a high volume protocol, you are training in kind of the face of fatigue. So you might be making more adaptations, but you're constantly always feeling beat up. So the actual expression of performance may not be as consistent. Now, in practice, and this is just my coaching anecdote and personal anecdote, what I see is more variability in performance when I'm doing a high-volume protocol. If it's effective, which is a big caveat, which I'll address in a second, but I'll see these spurts where, I have a good week, I get a little more rest, or I've got the mental fortitude to kind of push through the fatigue, and I hit a big PR. But it's kind of like this very, bipolar experience with my performance. Versus low volume, you're kind of consistently always ready to rock. So if you're making
that's what I feel.
Yeah, and if you're ready to hit a PR and you're doing enough volume and you're training specifically, then you'll be able to express that strength on a much more reliable basis than higher volume. And this is kind of why we generally see periodized approaches being used, very simple ones like volume, intensity, taper in strength athletes, because you're trying to get the best of both worlds, right? And you do need to think about long-term hypertrophy. So you can kind of monitor this as someone with much time in the game as you have, is like, all right, well, am I making PRs over the time course of multiple months and years that I'm obviously doing sufficient volume to get bigger and stronger? Because I'm not just getting way, 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 way better at these movements, especially if we're talking something like a machine press or something that you've been doing for years, right? So I think that's kind of the practical real world way to do it. I think the other thing to understand is that in research, we can just increase volume and keep everything else the same because we have people monitor their diets. We have research assistants yelling at you. You come in at the same time. But in the real world, when people change volume, it almost invariably changes other stuff. Frequency, exercise selection, sleep, diet, pain. You start modifying things. So, and most importantly, is probably proximity to failure. I think when I observe people train with high volume, they start pacing themselves just like you would if you're trying to maintain a 400 meter pace. Now you run 800 meters, you're going to run slower because you can't complete the race. And I think people do that unconsciously when they're training with high volume. They default to the proximity to failure, intention, exercise selection, and overall quote unquote challenge of each individual set that they can handle if they're going to be doing many, many more sets. So this interacts with that diminishing returns relationship. If the last 10 sets you add, going from 20 to 30, are way less effective than the 10 sets that you got preceding there, and it results in a slight loss in intensity, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, or sometimes even worse, right? So if you are decreasing volume while you're increasing the effectiveness of your individual set, and you're in a better recovery environment because you have the time and intentionality to focus on it, and you're not feeling beat up, and you're a little more motivated to train, now all of a sudden you might have a net better outcome. But it's not because of the volume went down. It's because of what happened when the volume went down. You trained closer to failure. You got better sleep. You didn't have as much overuse stuff. You're not waking up in the middle of the night because you have quad tendonitis, hand up right here or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, and I think people struggle with the research because they read the research and they go, more volume is better, but they go, I decreased my volume and I got better gains. And it's not the volume decrease, it's what came with it. So for me, when I started increasing my volume, I didn't just do it all of a sudden. I did it incrementally, and I kept auditing things like, all right, am I maintaining all of my good behavior? Am I too tired to get my steps in? Am I too beat up to actually use the exercises I wrote down? Am I constantly shifting to a back extension from an RDL?
Yeah.
I'm putting my sets online because people will call me out just like they did on that peptide article. This is supposed to be a 1 RIR. Do you think it's a 3? And I'm sandbagging it, right? So,
Yeah.
and then if I try to make that volume increase and I just get jacked up because I am maintaining intensity, then I'm not ready for it yet. And I should hold where I'm at because, more isn't always better. Better's better. And if I can adapt to it, maybe it'll be better, but I got to get there first, right? So I think that helps us reconcile the data versus the anecdotes.
Yeah, it's such a different, like so many things change as well. And I think one thing that I've seen with people, and maybe it's just the population that I work with, you might find it different with people that you coach, but people's recoverability is so much lower now with, and this is, once again, a whole different podcast, but just with, it's basically doom scrolling that's keeping people up, or their professional lives having bleed into their personal life, which was previously wind down time or time where you're off screens, off phone, maybe reading. Now it's just emails, it's Slack, or doom scrolling on Instagram. I've definitely seen that. So to actually get to those higher volumes is more challenging because they just can't get there in terms of performance. Like the performance is not, it may not be decreasing, but it's not increasing like we would want to see. I have one more question, then we'll wrap it up. I've had obviously a lot more questions, but time gets away on us, and I appreciate the depth in your answers. With the obvious input that you've had into the scientific world of the evidence-based community, and once again, on the online social media world is not a true representation of what is going on, but I think there is a lot of foolery, or there's just a lot of bullshit online, which is giving the whole evidence-based community, science-backed community, whatever you want to say, a really bad look. And it's annoying for me, but I'm not even in a position like you are. So like I guess what I'm saying, if I was you, I would be like, what the hell is going on? You've tried to put these studies forward, these ideas forward, and then there's these people that are just like taking it way too far, trying to rage bait people. And I feel like science is getting a bad name, where it used to be this like, oh, cool, it's evidence-based. Now we know for certain that it's going to have a likelihood to be more successful or a higher probability. I'm going to try and introduce it. Now it's almost like, oh, that's like too scientific. That's just lab coat bullshit. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to bro it out. And there's a lot of different camps, but I feel like that is becoming more and more popular. And my question is, what do you think the evidence-based world has got right? And where do you think we have potentially taken it too far?
Good question. I think that it really comes centrally down to actually knowing what it means to be evidence-based. And there's some people who will say science-based versus evidence-based to kind of make this clear distinction. There was a time period where the term evidence-based was just so meaningless because everyone said it got dragged through the mud. And I have always held firm to using the term evidence-based and explaining it because it comes from a concept that was critically important for medicine. Evidence-based medicine developed by Sackett and colleagues decades ago basically was a response to finding that like old crusty surgeons were still using techniques that they learned in medical school, in the 1950s when there were better options. And it was like, well, why is this happening? And it's because there wasn't a formal, management of continuing education to stay licensed, like most legitimate professions are. And medical professionals were not necessarily trained to stay up to date with research once they left medical school, their internship, and they weren't involved in, the process of knowledge creation and dissemination that was within the medical community. And once evidence-based medicine became a thing, it really had very clear positive impacts on patient experiences, but it had to be defined. And it wasn't just you read research. The initial concept of evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine was this three-pronged approach, and they're not all equal to one another. They apply in different circumstances, and they help one another, of respecting the patient's needs, desires, individual environment, and their individual response based upon all that to a given intervention. There's your clinical experience, all the things that you have seen that hopefully are done in a rigorous way. And this is where the scientific method becomes important, not just, yeah, bro, that BP 157 helped me heal so much. And it's like, well, what else did you do? Well, I changed my diet, I took some time off, I saw the physio, but I also took BP 157. That was the thing that did it, faulty pattern recognition, right? So actually using, good tracking of clinical experience, right? Building up pattern recognition and becoming a true expert. And then finally, staying up to date with the best available research evidence. And I think best available is very important because a lot of the times we're operating in a space where there isn't very good available evidence. And the closest thing you can use is anecdotes or case reports or narrative reviews or just our understanding of the principle or the theory. And that's okay because you still have to make a decision. And I think so long as evidence-based practice means that, and we see that there's this inherent respect for people's experiences, desires, and their need to be autonomous and the fact that they may not respond in the same way to the quote-unquote mean or the average. It doesn't mean that they're not human or that for you the volume relationship doesn't work. Like that's taking it too far. That sometimes occurs in kind of the anecdotal space. But also in the evidence-based space, what I think we've gotten wrong is that we've treated an absence of evidence as evidence of absence sometimes. So if there is not a PubMed ID, if there is not a study, or if there is pretty poor available evidence that is, it's got a PubMed ID attached to it, but it's actually a narrative review, and it's more or less just the opinion of a researcher, where we've elevated above, say, decades of experience of a strength and conditioning coach or athlete who does take really good notes, and we've gone, well, no, but that's not, that's just your anecdote. It's like, homie, that publication in a tier 4 journal that's a narrative review that has never actually been studied is also an anecdote. It just went through maybe not that good a peer review at the time. So I think it's essentially, you can have a halo effect and create a guru out of anything. And this is what humans do. We put things on pedestals, and a lot of people in our era when we were coming up, we had put, IFBB pros, powerlifters, bodybuilders, fitness influencers, someone who wrote an article who we see as an authority on a pedestal. They're the guru. Anything they say goes, and I don't need, my own critical thinking skills. And then I got burned. I found out they're an idiot, they're a narcissist, they're trying to sell me something, or they're just wrong, or they're wrong in certain cases. And we went, I need to get away from that. The fitness industry burned me. I took the stupid supplement, I'm going to find something that's more reliable. And then evidence-based fitness information comes along, and we think this is always right. And it didn't change the way we thought about things. We didn't all of a sudden start being critical thinkers and a little more independent, and considering this new avenue of making decisions, this third leg of the stool, instead of just kind of relying on the two. We just replaced the guru with science. Big science. Like, okay, if science says it, I want to do it, without really thinking about what that means. So some of the content creators in this space, and they're almost never actual researchers, which I want to point out, they leverage that too far, and they essentially discount the roles of these other two extremely important aspects of evidence-based practice. And I think because researchers focus on that, they kind of let that happen. They saw it as an overall positive thing, and maybe it's like a course correct. We're so bro-sciencey right now, so focused on anecdote. You know what? If we go a little too research heavy, it's fine. But now the pendulum's gone too far; it's going to swing back. But Brock, I'm not worried about it, because this kind of thing self-corrects. If you try to poison the well and you discount all of science, you're basically discounting empiricism. You're discounting the idea of cause and effect. You're saying, you know what, these freaking scientists talking about how, the Earth is round and it orbits the sun and the sun comes up every day. I'm pretty sure the sun only came up because I prayed to the sun god. I'm going to go back to that. We need to get back to our I know what's up. I can't see the curvature of the Earth. It's probably flat. Let me post about it on Facebook, how, the Earth is flat, not realizing that the only reason Facebook can sync and you can see it in the internet is because of satellites that respect the fact the Earth is round, but truth, so the point is you can only move away from the universal way that all human cultures have eventually established how we figure things out, which is an experimental design. I try the thing, I change one thing, I see what happens, is it repeatable? If you decide to move away from that mechanism of figuring things out, good luck to you, sir. But you'll be coming back around to the scientific method eventually, even if you discount it being the scientific method. If it's just, good old in the trenches bro science or experience, okay, cool. But let's be honest, this is what you're doing. And that's just what I'm doing in a lab in a more controlled condition. So I'm not worried, but I really do think we have to respect all aspects of evidence-based practice and promote that, and make sure that we're actually not just telling people what to do, but also why and how to do it. And I think educating the fitness consumer may not be what they think they want, but it's definitely what they need, so that they're not caught up in all of the misinformation and bullshit that's out there.
Yeah, I think that's such a cool way to put it, because I've chatted to Tony Battaji online, who was a mentor of mine when I was starting as a personal trainer here in Sydney. I used to go over to his gym and do his seminars and all that kind of stuff. And I actually had him on the podcast early on a few years ago, and I actually see him in the gym every now and then. And he was talking about that side of evidence-based practice where, yes, there's studies and there's peer-reviewed science and there's, RCTs, but there's also anecdote. And I feel like personally where people get it wrong is they're either one or the other. There's so much just heavy anecdote, like this is what I've learned in the gym, this is what I do for bench press, it's the best technique to do, like you have to do it, or this is how much volume I do, or the bro split, that's what I do, and that's the best. When then there's it's the pairing, or like you said, the three prongs, like having them all together, the well-rounded approach, which unfortunately doesn't rage bait or go viral, but actually leads to long-term, it leads to long-term results. And that's why I, have this podcast, because I want to have chats like this that are educational, and people can have more of a balanced approach, because that's why I personally went into, or being more curious about the kind of evidence and the science of it was, when I was in City Fitness, no one was talking about that. When I first started as a personal trainer, it wasn't like, what's the research saying? Like, what's the best way to approach clients? It was just, this is what worked for me. You do it now. Or, I think this is good. It was kind of like relative to the personal trainer. Well, that's the people that I was surrounded with. It was like, this is what I learned, or I have a powerlifting background. This is what I do. Now, all my clients, they're basically powerlifters. Like, I saw a lot of people do that. Or they were competitive bodybuilders, and they had these, overweight women in their 40s doing like bro workouts as if they were competing like an IFBB pro, and it was very that. So I learned that when I got outside of that and didn't train people like me, because once again, very high level of physical activity, loved sport, did sport, in all my spare time, loved training, loved sprints and things like that. the people that I were training did not come from that background. They were, mainly academics, and they didn't enjoy sport, and they didn't. So they're not going to do it for the love of it. They want to get the most out of their time and the most out of their dollars that they were paying me. So I quickly found out that the smarter and more intelligent I got with the way that I just dealt with my clients, the more successful I was as a personal trainer. And that just so happened to be with, trying to pair, like, especially when I had no experience, like what the research was saying with the little experience I had, and as the experience growed, like that just seemed to work best for them. And then they also, as academics, had comfort knowing, oh, this is actually behind something because I could explain it. And they were going, oh, this guy isn't just some 22-year-old dipshit, because as we were talking about before, it's hard to sell personal training when you're young, and trying to sell to 40-year-old, 50-year-olds. But that really helped me. So I guess that's why I have this kind of love or bias towards the scientific community in terms of fitness. But I love how you were saying we have to bring it back to evidence, to anecdote, and to what we've actually learned and what we're doing ourselves, because that is also valuable. And one is not better than the other. They all kind of lead to the same place. I wanted to wrap up with 3 questions. I wrap up the podcast with 3 questions. I'm real big into self-development. What is a book that has made you better, a quote, and a habit that you do? It could be a daily habit or just something that you do that helps to make you better. But I like to use this as a platform to kind of give people tools for self-development.
Let's start with the quote. It's not someone else's quote, but it's something I remind myself of. My resting screensaver, for those who are, if there's a video component to this, I'll actually say it out loud. Just anytime I look at my phone, which is, like you correctly identified, is something that causes a lot of issues in modern society, as great as it is be grateful, be present, and do one thing at a time, and that allows me to not be the double-edged sword of being what I describe as a human doing rather than a human being. I like to get stuff done. I like to accomplish things. I like to be on mission. I'm a sports person too. I feel most engaged in life when I'm accomplishing things, solving problems, helping people. But I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in that I miss opportunities to connect, and to reflect, and to be able to feel a sense of meaning from all of those things. And that is really, I think, what makes people, I wouldn't say happy, but live a fulfilled life. Happiness is sometimes fickle. And that connects to the book that I think is really, really impactful for me, and that's A Man's Search for Meaning, which is a great book about someone who found meaning, and actually, was a psychologist and developed a whole, way of thinking about this, while actually being in some of the worst possible human conditions during the Holocaust. They were in an internment camp in Nazi Germany. So those two things, I think, connect really well. And it just kind of, it's a sad but also very inspiring story of that you can find meaning, and it gives you such the like agency to do that, even when you're in a really, really bad external environment. So that's the quote, that's the book, and the third thing I forgot because I wasn't present.
Habit.
A
habit.
Yeah. So I think the meal rhythm is actually really, 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 really good. I want to highlight that point, and that's something that I think we don't promote or talk about enough in the fitness industry, because we kind of get focused on ways of controlling energy balance. And like, you'll see people I went through If It Fits Your Macros, and I ate different things every day, but so long as it fits, it fits. And then I did intermittent fasting, and then I did this. And I think all of that stuff is great. There's a ton of tools out there. But from what I have seen, especially for the people we work with, where we like to play with our diets and find what works best for us, and manipulating it's kind of part of the fun, at least in certain stages of our lives. The people we work with just want to find something that works to stick with it and not think about it. For some of our clients, we're just trying to get them to not seeing us as like visiting the dentist. And it's like pulling teeth. We can't expect them to love and want to train 12 times a week when their schedule allows it. We just want them to get them to not dislike training, and it to become a habit, like maybe worst case scenario, brushing their teeth. You know, like nobody likes brushing their teeth. Maybe dental hygienists do, and they're having conversations like we do about training about, oh man, I love this, new toothbrush. But I think for me personally, like it took me decades to figure out how to floss regularly, and it's not the best way to do it. But I've got these, the little smile picks that are like pre-made floss, and we leave it on the table so that my wife and I, after we finish eating, we each hand each other a stick and we clean our teeth while we're watching TV. If I just put the floss in the medicine cabinet and closed it, for all the same reasons that the healthy food, if it's out of sight, out of mind, and the dirty, and the not dirty, but the higher calorie, easy to eat processed foods available, is the same reason why I didn't floss, that there's people struggling to control their diet now. So I had to figure that out. And of course, the dental hygienist is probably thinking, well, it'd be better if you did it after lunch and before bed, and that you were a little more, consistent with it. But I'm sure they would also go, if that was what finally got you to start flossing at the age of 40, fantastic, keep doing it. And I think that's the perspective that we need to have. And one of those, I think, is having a meal rhythm so that there's less active choice and restraint. Instead of just telling your clients, hey, you can eat 3 meals a day or 6 or anything that fits your macros, it's like, yes, that's true. And let's figure out what fits you best. And then let's automate it. Let's make it just the thing you do. Connect it to your values and make it part of your identity.
Yeah, that structured flexibility that you kind of mentioned before. I love the quote that you were touching on, and I also love that book. I read it last year, and I found it very helpful as well. And that meal rhythm thing is awesome too. I've actually been trying to, not trying to think of something like myself and try to come up with my own method, but like I've just personally found that when people snack, they often just go over their calories.
Yep.
And it's a simple thing that people do, but it's also hard to say just don't snack,
right,
to people, because it doesn't sit well. Like it's not sexy. Like if you say a don't to something, it's not easy. But I think the meal rhythm could be a really good way to put it, and it sounds a bit more educational than just don't snack. But I like the idea of meal rhythm because it's actually something that, I was thinking about it while you were saying it. That's something that I apply to myself. Like I personally don't like snacking because I feel like it robs me of the joy that I get from my meals.
Yes, you're not.
Because I really like the kind of that like satiated feeling. Like even when my wife's like, oh, can you taste dinner? Or like, oh, do you want to have this or that? I try to say no because, without offending her, of course. But I try to say no because I really like that drive to have a meal. And I've been trying to think of a concept that kind of lines up with like, obviously you don't have to like deprive yourself of snacks if you really enjoy it. But having a steady meal rhythm really makes sense. And I find that that's what's really anchored me to like have a long-term diet. Doesn't feel like I'm in a prison cell where, I do flexibly diet, but I do try to find the path of least resistance. And for me, it's like 3 main meals and a dessert.
Perfect.
Or like a piece of fruit or whatever. And for a lot of people, it could be different, but I think, that meal rhythm is just a really solid concept. So thanks for sharing that. And once again, man, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've loved having you on. I love all the input that you put into the fitness community, to the industry, from the food pyramid and the muscle strength pyramid that you kind of put out there. I've been following ever since. And, it's a big part of what I do to try and stay up to date is like reading research reviews like yours and Alan Aragon's and, trying to stay up to date with what you're kind of saying in this space, because I feel like I'm on the money in terms of like the evidence research. Like you're saying, like it's not just about anecdote and what the research is saying, but like what is the best current research. And personally, I struggle with like if I just open PubMed and just try to find research, I'm not the best at doing that, and it's quite difficult to navigate. But I find that having your review and having other reviews, I feel like I'm in safe hands. So, from a coach in the industry, I really appreciate having you on. It's such a cool time to be on social media and to be around, because to have you on the podcast is like a dream, like I have, like coming up in the industry, like when I was at City Fitness, there was no like, or maybe I could have reached out then, but like it was harder to feel like I could get my hands on like really solid information. And, now I feel like it's more present. So thank you so much for that. How can people reach out to you, follow your research or, use your coaching?
I'm super honored by that. Thank you so much, and I'm really glad to hear that feedback, because sometimes when you're a content creator, as you probably know, it kind of just feels like you're putting stuff out there, and there's this whirlwind of information online, and actually getting to connect with someone and for them to express the impact. I think it's important for that, staying present, doing one thing at a time, and reflecting. So I appreciate that opportunity, and it's an honor. So yeah, if people want to follow my work, it really depends upon how much of a nerd you are and what you're looking for. So if you want to be like Brock and stay up to date with the latest published research, check out massresearchreview.com. If you're like, listen, I don't want to commit to reading, a master's thesis level of content every month, just, hey, can you give me the rundown of the big principles? Please check out muscleandstrengthpyramids.com. You can get the PDF versions of my books, actually our books, I should say, because I have co-authors. Or you can get them on Amazon if you want to have a physical book you can hold. We just wrote the third editions and finished them last year in December. So a couple months ago. So they are very up to date, and I am really proud of them. And they talk specifically about evidence-based practice. And if you're looking for coaching, we work with anyone who's interested for strength and hypertrophy or body composition goals at 3dmusclejourney.com. We serve anybody, recreational or competitive, in kind of the drug-free lifting space. And I get to act as the science officer there to make sure that our coaches are up to date, just like Brock does. I can guarantee that you're going to be in great hands. We've been coaching since 2009 or 10, depending upon when you say the estimated date of 3D Muscle Journey started, and that's 3dmusclejourney.com. And then if you finally want to hear me appear on other people's awesome platforms like this podcast, please do check me out on Instagram, where I am at Helms3DMJ, which is where I typically am most active on social media.
Awesome, man. Well, yeah, thanks once again for your work, and thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been awesome.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this podcast with Eric Helms. If you want another conversation with a great evidence-based coach, this is a chat that I had with Dr. Mike Israetel.